where we were last time was we were talking about ventilation. Somebody tell me what ventilation is. Ventilation. Breathing, yes. And what we want is airflow, yes? And like in fluids, it was F equals delta P over R, but this time the delta P was specific pressures. It was always the difference between alveolar pressure and atmospheric pressure, or the other way around, whichever way the difference is. So, atmospheric. I think I put atmospheric first. ATM, ALV. And we know that if atmospheric pressure is greater than alveolar pressure, then air will move in, yeah? And if the opposite, then air will move out. We know that those pressure differences are created by changing volume. And the volume is created by what? Volume changes are created by what? No. What? How do you create volume changes in the thoracic cavity?
Change the pressure.
No. Contraction and relaxation of muscles creates the volume changes, and the volume change creates the pressure change. Right? Does that make sense? That's the relationship. The last thing that we were talking about, and I think you guys kind of all understood these, right? The whole breathing. The last thing we were talking about, and we didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about it, is that this only works to move air in and out if what your thoracic cavity does. Why do I feel so short today? I mean, I am short, but hi. What your thoracic cavity does, your alveoli and your lungs do, right? And in order for that to occur, and this is where we left last time, what has to be true is that the pressure in this fluid right here has to be lower than atmospheric pressure and alveolar pressure. So let's go back to the whole atmospheric pressure and alveolar pressure with this picture that we were talking about. So last thing that we talked about when we left was that if you go with the constant atmospheric pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, 760 millimeters of mercury, which is, it varies a little bit depending on where you are and what elevation and stuff, but, it's relatively constant for a location. If you go with a relatively constant pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury, in order to cause air to move in, all you have to do is drop the pressure below 760, and in order for air to move out, you need to just pop it above. It doesn't even have to be very dramatic. So this is normal tidal breathing, only with this picture, and this is where we left off last time. This zero is actually not zero. It's atmospheric pressure, so it's 760. With me? Okay, so if I drop the pressure below, meaning -1, 759, but we don't want to have to keep track of it because it feels like math. Right? 759, right? Then air will move in, right? But what is the pressure between breaths? 0, which is really equal to 760. So there is no difference between alveolar pressure and atmospheric pressure between breaths. Does that make sense? So air's not moving anywhere because there's no pressure gradient. Yes? Okay. And then if you want air to move out, you just pop it slightly above +1 or 761, right? And then air moves out. But this only works if, again, the alveoli are stuck to the wall of the thoracic cavity. So with our zeros and ones and everything, let's look at what's happening. This is the lungs in between breaths, right? Okay, relaxed, but the air has already moved out. So the alveolar pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure. What should be true in the fluid between the visceral and the parietal pleura is that should be a vacuum, yeah? And a vacuum meaning lower pressure than atmospheric pressure, okay? How low do you generally want it to be? You generally want it to be about -4, which is 756. Math. 756, right? Okay, so what does that do? When it's got a negative pressure, it basically uses the hydrogen bonding in the fluid to keep those things adhered to one another. So with the combination of negative pressure and hydrogen bonding, that means when the thoracic cavity increases in size, the lungs stay stuck to the wall, right? That makes sense? You need moisture and a vacuum in order for that to occur, right? Does that make sense? You've tried to pull apart 2 pieces of plastic, right? If there's a vacuum between them, you're not going to get the damn things apart, especially if it's moist in there because of hydrogen bonding. So this is what we call intrapleural pressure. And intrapleural pressure, that quiz question, should always be the lowest, right? Lower that atmospheric, lower than alveolar pressure. And what that does is keeps the wall adhered. Now this develops naturally during development, but of course you can compromise this, and this is where we left off last time, by if you damage the wall of the thoracic cavity without even touching a lung, what will happen to the pressure here? It will equal atmospheric pressure. And then, because the lungs are relatively elastic structures, if they are not suctioned out and stuck by hydrogen bonding, they will collapse on themselves and you don't even have to touch them. Does that make sense? And so the last thing we talked about before we left is that some of you guys have experience with this. If you have a pneumothorax or if you have a collapsed lung for any reason, how do you fix this? You suction it, add a little moisture so that you get the hydrogen bonding, right? And then you suction it out. As long as it's well adhered, you plug the hole, hope for the best. And then if it stays stuck, you're golden. If it doesn't, you might have to do it again. You might need another test tube. Does that make sense? So this is called a pneumothorax. Okay, everybody good? And it sort of demonstrates the importance of that negative intrapleural pressure. Okay, so that's the pneumothorax idea. Okay, so now what we have to talk about is this. So we talked about flow, which is really just the difference between those two pressures, and we know why air flows in and air flows out, yes? And now we have to talk about resistance. When we talked about resistance with the cardiovascular system, it was primarily what's going on in the tubes, right? Gunky tubes, long tubes, squishy tubes, whatever. So same thing here, really. What's going on with resistance has primarily to do with the tubes, but then also a little bit of the stretchiness of the thing. So resistance is impacted by anything that actually changes the diameter or the elasticity or the scarring of the tube. So first, the size of the ventilation passageways. The size of the ventilation passageways as you are moving in, both the bronchs and the bronchioles, right, all the way down. If you have anything that causes dilation or constriction, you impact resistance, right? Right? So if you do constriction, you'll increase resistance, decrease flow, duh, right? Dilation, the opposite. That's primarily controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic usually causes bronchial dilation, parasympathetic bronchial constriction. Okay, everybody good with that? But then remember, you also can have bronchial constriction like in an asthma or an allergy attack situation that's initiated by paracrine agents, right? So if in the middle of fall and all that pollen is out there, we've got a huge pine tree in my front yard, it's just freaking pine sperm everywhere, and you snort up the pine sperm, right? And your body says, no consent, you didn't ask, and then your bronchioles constrict as a protective mechanism. Then you're going to have potential wheezing and problem breathing. Asthma can do that without the actual allergen involved. Asthma can be mediated by bunches of different things. Okay, and then hormonal epinephrine. We know that nervous system epinephrine will dilate the bronchioles, but also hormonal epinephrine will dilate the bronchioles. So if you get into a situation in which a person has massive bronchial constriction because of an allergic response, like that person who's tragically allergic to peanuts, what do they give as a rescue medication? Epi, yeah? And epi can contradict what's going on with the vessels, the heart, and now the respiratory system. Everybody good? Okay, and then of course, if you have any kind of mucus accumulation because of chronic illness or chronic irritation, that will also narrow the tube. Good? So those are all things that impact the tubes. And then if you have fibrosis, so anything that scars up the tubes all the way down to the alveoli will decrease your lungs' ability to increase in size and decrease in size. That's called compliance, and that will add to resistance. So here's what healthy lungs do. When I try to inhale really massively, they stretch out, and when I try to exhale, they snap back, which helps with the exhaling. That's what healthy lungs do. Does that make sense? So they're stretchy in their wall. So the other thing is, let's just talk a little bit about lung compliance, and we go back to this whole idea of the pressure in the intrapleural space. So the pressure in here, okay, what we want in order for those lungs to stay adhered to the wall and therefore stretch when I pull on them and snap back but not collapse, is I want a decent difference between alveolar pressure and intrapleural pressure. This concept is called transpulmonary pressure, but it's just if this one is 0, I want this one to be -4, not -3, not -1, not -2. If there's not a big enough difference, then they don't pull out dependably and they don't snap back dependably. So that actually determines lung compliance. So the change in volume from a given change in the pressure, it's a measure of the stretching force across the lungs. So the larger the difference between those two creates a larger pressure on the alveoli to expand, and this allows for also them moving when they should. The elasticity of the lungs also is involved in lung compliance. And then last but not least, the surface tension in the alveoli. So we'll talk about, so this is the sort of hydrogen bonding around the outside of the alveolus, but I'm about to tell you guys in just a minute that there's also fluid on the inside of the alveolus. And that one can actually oppose stretching. And we'll get to that one in just a second when we talk about respiratory distress syndrome. Okay, so here's something that's kind of cool, as long as it's working well. As long as it's working well, so let's look. So this is the inside of an alveolus. An alveolus is primarily made of simple squamous epithelium, which you all learned in anatomy, right? But there are a couple other kinds of cells in there that you didn't learn in anatomy. And these little guys right here, these are called type 2 cells, okay? They're different because what those do is when I stretch them, they will actually secrete something called surfactant, and they actually secrete it inside the alveolus. Surfactant is a detergent that actually temporarily breaks up hydrogen bonding. So in a healthy adult, here's what will happen. When you inhale massively, like a big inhalation, it stretches your alveoli. But then the hydrogen bonding from the fluid on the inside of the alveoli will sort of oppose their ability to stretch. But then these guys will actually dump surfactant in whenever they're stretched and will actually temporarily break up the hydrogen bonding so you can get a good stretch. Does that make sense to you? So basically, you'll get the alveoli will be able to stretch better when you need them to if you are a healthy adult. Good? Does that make sense to you guys? So if you stretch these, they will actually break up the hydrogen bonding just temporarily, every single time. Like when you're working out, that's what they will do, okay? If you don't secrete surfactant, then what happens is this moist inner surface will oppose stretching because of the hydrogen bonding on the fluid. So let's go back to respiratory distress syndrome of the newborn. Well, with a newborn, sometimes full term, but very often if they are born preterm, you can have problems with the respiratory system being completely developed. So the last body system to come completely online and work independently is the respiratory system. They don't breathe, they don't really use it until the moment they hit the air, right? So it's been growing, it's been developing, but if, like my son, who was born 3 weeks early, what can happen is that their lungs are not properly developed enough that they are producing surfactant. The type 2 cells are really the last of the last to develop. So if the baby is full term, sometimes they're not completely developed, and if they're preterm, a lot of times they're not completely developed. So here's what can happen in a situation like that. What can happen in a situation like that, and what happened with my son, and he ended up in the NICU for 10 days, is he was born preterm, and he was really struggling to breathe. So if I looked at his little thorax right when he was born, you could see this massive effort for inhalation, right? But then exhalation is passive, right? And so he would try really hard to inhale, and then his little thorax would just collapse on exhalation. And he did that for a few minutes, and then what happened is he popped a pneumothorax, only it was actually a mediastinothorax because it happened from the inner surface, just from all of that straining on his little undeveloped lungs. One of his lungs collapsed, and luckily we were at the right place. We were at St. Mark's. I had a high-risk pregnancy anyway. They immediately took care of him. His O2 sat went really far down. It kind of turned purple, freaked the hell out of everybody. He's fine. He's 13 now. He's sassy as hell, got a green mohawk. Everybody's good. Okay, so so what they, of course, did was immediately put in a little chest tube, suck his little lung out, little fluid, little chest tube, little complete oxygen. He's a little tank for a couple of days, and then he's totally fine, right? Really good medical care. This is one of the many reasons why, even though I have lots and lots of hippie friends who want to have an underwater water birth with a doula and some chanting, I am very, very pro having actually a medical professional at any birth, because you never know what the hell's going to happen, right? You don't. And if he had not been able to get immediate medical care, he probably would have died. And considering my heart problem, I don't know how much I would have been able to help him in that situation. So, but he's good. He's golden now. So that's respiratory distress syndrome of the newborn. It's the second leading cause of death in newborns, which means that you should probably make sure that there's a medical care professional around.
Isn't SIDS the first?
I don't know what the first is right now. I haven't checked lately. Okay, we'll come back to these clinical connections if we have time. Let's get the rest of the stuff going. Okay, so ventilation is what we've been talking about now, and now we're going to talk about respiration. It sounds hard, but it's not, okay? Respiration is not air in and air out, it's gas moving, typically across epithelial membranes. Good? So what we are going to do is we're going to talk about gas exchange between the atmosphere and the lungs, and then between the tissues and the cells, right? So what we are going to do is we're going to talk about external respiration, which is every gas exchange before cellular respiration. But again, ventilation is not gas exchange. That's just whole air moving in and out. When we're doing gas exchange, we're moving a specific gas one direction or the other. So the only thing that we have to talk about this makes it sound hard, but it's really not. And that is when people talk about gases moving, especially gases moving in air, but also gases moving in fluid, instead of talking about gases moving down concentration gradients, they talk about gases moving down something called the partial pressure gradient, but it's not terrible because for our purposes, they're almost the same. So atmosphere is a mix of gases. Some of them we don't particularly take in because we don't need them and they're not particularly transportable. Right? So they don't move into our body in any specific quantity that we need to worry about. But the atmosphere, all have it 760 millimeters of mercury. All of that pressure is due to oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor, and some others, right? But the two that we're really going to be concerned with is those two. There are specific mechanisms for them, and there are specific reasons that we need them in the body. So the movement of gas molecules within a closed container and their collisions exerts pressure. And each gas adds to the partial pressure. Yes? So the total pressure is the sum of the partial pressures of the individual gases. Okay? So instead of saying that oxygen moves down its concentration gradient, we say oxygen moves down its partial pressure gradient. Simply because the physicists like to remind us that if you squished the atmosphere, that would change. Yes? If you stretch the atmosphere, that would change. Or if you heated the damn thing up, that would change. But we're not going to do that over the course of a breathing cycle. So for our purposes, although physicists would definitely disagree with us, we can say that the partial pressure gradient is analogous to a concentration gradient. Because we're not squishing you, we ain't changing planets, we're not going to heat the damn thing up over the course of this lecture. Good? Okay, so instead of saying concentration of oxygen, we call it the PO2, which is the partial pressure of oxygen. Instead of saying the concentration of carbon dioxide, we call it the PCO2, which is the partial pressure. Okay, so what do the gases do in a mixture? Oxygen moves down oxygen's partial pressure gradient, doesn't give a crap what carbon dioxide is doing. Carbon dioxide moves down its partial pressure gradient, doesn't give a crap what oxygen's doing. And neither one of them give a crap about nitrogen or water vapor. Good? Okay, so external respiration. So basically what we are going to do with external respiration is we're going to do gas exchange twice. We're going to do it at the pulmonary capillaries, alveoli to pulmonary capillaries, and then systemic capillaries to tissues. Good? Those are the two steps of external respiration. And then all of that, just to make sure that we get the big picture, is going to serve internal respiration. So once you got, which is the same as cellular respiration. So I want you to think of this about this for a second. There is one thing in this whole story that is driving the concentration gradients. And what is it? What is driving concentration or pressure gradients? What is creating the unsatisfiable gradient for instance, oxygen? Is it the atmosphere constantly changing? No, what is it? It is cellular respiration. Because you are a living critter, your need for oxygen will never be satiated, and your supply of carbon dioxide that you're generating also will never stop. So whereas the atmospheric oxygen and carbon dioxide is relatively constant, you are never, ever going to be satisfied until you die. And even then, the bacteria is going to need some stuff, right? So the driving force for all of these gradients is going to be cellular respiration because you are a living organism. And so what's going to happen is that is constantly dissatisfied and it's going to drive the other thing. So that's what we're going to see. So basically, gas exchange, of course, occurs twice. It's going to occur between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. So we are going to do gas exchange. Where is it? We're going to do gas exchange here, right? We're going to send it back to the heart. Heart's going to send it to the systemic capillaries, and then we're going to do gas exchange again. So it's not hard. So gas exchange is going to occur across what we call the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane is just this teeny tiny thin membrane right here. It's about 2/10 of, it says a meter. That's not 2/10 of a meter. 2/10 of a micrometer. It's really, really thin, and it's also really, really branched. So remember the respiratory membrane that you're talking about at the alveoli. Each cluster of alveoli has like a wrapping, a snuggly net of capillaries on the surface, and they're really thin because the alveolus is made of simple squamous epithelium mostly. And then, of course, the capillary membrane is made of simple squamous epithelium. And then all they have in between them is a basement membrane. So practically no impediment to transport at all. And then again, oxygen is lipid soluble and carbon dioxide is really easily transported. The other thing is that there's so many of these alveoli. If you look at how dense a healthy lung is, it's really, really dense tissue. When I was a kid, I swear I just thought it was like an empty bag, right? And it just filled and emptied and filled and emptied. But it's not. If you stretched out the surface area of both lungs in an average sized person, it's 750 square feet of surface area. I have lived in apartments smaller than that. And if you haven't, congratulations on your privileged life. Okay? It's nice. I'm happy for you. So 750 square feet, like the size of a tennis court. Really, really big. So the other thing about the lungs that makes them really, really efficient at gas exchange is that they always have a disproportionate amount of blood in them. At any given moment, the lungs have about 1 liter of blood running through them. So really thin, lots of surface area, lots of blood going through them. Okay, so basically what we are going to do is, and we're going to see a video of this in just a second, the blood that's coming into the lungs through the pulmonary capillaries, and you guys know this from anatomy, is going to be high P what, low P what? High PCO2, low PO2, right? Of course. And then the air that we breathe in has comparatively high PO2, low PCO2. We do breathe in carbon dioxide all the time, guys. It's just at a lower concentration than the blood that's coming there, so of course it's not going to move that direction most of the time. Okay, so low PO2, high PCO2. So the circulation is going to move the blood across those pulmonary capillaries, those weird-looking pulmonary capillaries. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pick up oxygen and we're going to drop off carbon dioxide. But specifically when we pick up oxygen, we don't just pick it up into the bloodstream. We actually move it into the red blood cell and it gets a seat on the hemoglobin, right? Good. And then the blood becomes red because it's sitting on hemoglobin, right? And so then we are going to send that blood back to the heart. You know where it's going to go, left atrium, left ventricle, pumped into systemic circulation. This blood is high P what, low P what? High PO2, low PCO2, right? Good. So now we're sending it to the systemic capillaries and the tissue cells, high PO2, low PCO2. The tissues, and I want you to tell me why. I know you know, but verbalize it anyway. The tissues will generally have a low PO2 and a high PCO2. Why? Cellular respiration. And the more metabolically active they are, the more dramatic that difference, right? So in a tissue that is actively metabolizing, you're going to have really low oxygen and really high carbon dioxide, which is just fine and dandy because it creates a greater gradient for things to move in and out. Everybody good? Okay, so what is going to happen in that situation is you are going to end up unloading off of the hemoglobin oxygen into the blood plasma, interstitial fluid, cell, right? Carbon dioxide is going to move cell, interstitial fluid, blood. Does that make sense? Okay, so Now let me just show you an animation to show you how all of this is related to cellular respiration and bring it all home for you. Ready?
Fresh air
Oops.
entering the lung carries oxygen with a PO2 of 106.
Okay. You don't have to memorize
Fresh air
the numbers,
entering the lung carries
but you do have to look at the gradients, high to low, right?
oxygen with a PO2 of 160. The presence of moisture in the lung results in reduction of the PO2 to 104. Fresh air entering the lung carries carbon dioxide with a pCO2 of 0.3. The carbon dioxide delivered to the lung from the blood raises the pCO2 to 40. At the arterial ends of the pulmonary capillaries, oxygen diffuses from the air in the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli because of differences in partial pressures. As a result of diffusion, at the venous ends of the pulmonary capillaries, the PO2 in the blood is equal to the PO2 in the alveoli, and the pCO2 in the blood is equal to the pCO2 in the alveoli. With no differences in partial pressure, there is no more net movement of oxygen or carbon dioxide.
So this just means when you have no gradient, you're not going to get any diffusion. Don't let this confuse you, though, right here, because all that happens is as it goes through the bloodstream, those epithelial cells are going to need a little oxygen, so they'll take a little bit on the way, but not much.
Oxygen diffuses out of the arterial ends of tissue capillaries into the tissue fluid, then into the cells, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cells into the tissue fluid.
So the gradient for oxygen, right, 95, 40, 20, it's going to move in, right? And the gradient for carbon dioxide, 46, 45, 40, it's going to move back out into the bloodstream. Good?
Then into the blood because of differences in partial pressures. At the venous ends of tissue capillaries, the PO2 in the blood is equal to the PO2 in the tissue fluid, and the pCO2 in the blood is equal to the pCO2 in the tissue fluid, resulting in no more net movement of oxygen or carbon dioxide.
But notice what is never satisfied, right? You can get these two, right, satisfied, but this one will never be satisfied as long as that tissue is alive.
The blood now carries the oxygen and carbon dioxide to the lungs. In the body, all of these exchanges occur simultaneously.
Does that make sense? It's pretty logical, right? Okay. All right. So all of this, 2 stages of external respiration serve internal respiration, which is cellular respiration. Everybody good? Okay. So now all we need to talk about is how gases are transported in the bloodstream. Okay. So you got to transport oxygen, and you know how most of it is transported on hemoglobin. And you have to transport carbon dioxide, but you don't know how all of that is transported unless you learned it in another class. Okay. So let us talk about transport of oxygen. So this is just a super simplified figure. This is supposed to be a red blood cell. This is the hemoglobin in the red blood cell. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of oxygen as it's transported in the blood is not in the plasma, but inside the red blood cell on the hemoglobin, right? So, and that is basically saturation of hemoglobin. So this is almost 100% saturated, GC, 98.5% saturated because one of them's not. And you usually get up close to 100. It's not always at 100. A lot of times it isn't at 100. So at any given moment, some oxygen is on its way in and out of the hemoglobin. So you have about 1.5% that's in the plasma. About 98.5% in systemic arterial blood is actually on the hemoglobin. Of course, it makes it bright red, right? And we call that oxyhemoglobin. So oxyhemoglobin is bright red, right? Deoxyhemoglobin is dull red. The only reason this works is because hemoglobin acts like a little oxygen bus with 4 seats specifically for oxygen, and then some other seats where other things could. But imagine that those 4 seats are like the seats on public transportation that are reserved for people who are handicapped or elderly. Those are the only people who should be sitting there. It's exclusively for oxygen. Anybody else sitting there was raised wrong. It's true. Like the dude, 25, totally fit, on his phone, not making eye contact. I want to grab his phone and say, I'm going to text your mother. I'm going to text her. I'm going to tell her. Okay, so, but it only works if it's relatively reversible, like if it's quick to load and quick to unload, right? Quick to load, quick to unload, right? So you need it to load onto hemoglobin quickly and unload off of it really quickly. So that concept is called affinity. How much does oxygen like to load? And how much it is loaded is called saturation. So this is arterial blood and this is venous blood. Arterial blood about 98.5% saturated, venous blood about 75% saturated. So a lot of times we like to think that all the oxygen is gone. It's not gone. It's just higher in arterial blood than it is in venous blood, but it's not completely desaturated in most of us. Okay, so now what we need to do is to look at the factors that determine how much oxygen gets on the bus and how much oxygen gets off the bus. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so this is not hard. All I need you to do is think about the forest before we actually look at the trees. So first question is, we've got two sets of capillary beds. We've got pulmonary capillary beds and systemic capillary beds. So before we even get into the details of it, you tell me which capillary bed should load oxygen onto hemoglobin. Pulmonary, yes? Okay, so everything that's true at the pulmonary capillary beds should favor oxygen loading onto hemoglobin, correct? And then the systemic capillary beds should favor what?
Unloading.
Unloading, right? And everything that's true at that capillary bed should favor unloading. Does that make sense? So now that you've got your predictions, we can add in, we got two forests, we can add in the trees. And it's not as hard if you do it that way. So now let's add in the trees. So first thing that will determine how much oxygen combines with hemoglobin is logical. How much oxygen do you have, right? So before you get into the details, which capillary bed should have a higher PO2? No. Pulmonary. Come on, guys. Air. Pulmonary capillary beds should have a higher PO2, right? Because you just brought it in, really high concentration, 104 out there. Does that make sense? So, not surprisingly, the higher the PO2, the more oxyhemoglobin you're going to form. The lower the PO2, the more you are going to, for instance, unload it onto the capillary bed. Basically, the higher the PO2, the more oxyhemoglobin is formed, and then vice versa. So high PO2 favors loading, yes, like happens at the lungs. In the lungs, 90% hemoglobin gets 90% saturated even when the PO2 is only 60 millimeters of mercury because the air is usually 104. So there's a decent gradient, right? Just because of where we live, right? So the air on this planet at this point is relatively high oxygen even compared to what we need. So there's always a pretty distinct gradient. So it's going to move. Unless you get up to the top of Everest, right? Then there's not much oxygen availability. So what do they do unless they're Sherpas who've grown up there? They use oxygen, yeah? Because they need to create the gradient. Does that make sense? Okay, the gradient doesn't exist. They haven't actually acclimated to that, so they're going to use sort of artificial gradient. Okay, so wherever PO2 is low, like it is comparatively in the systemic capillary beds, and the reason it's low is because of what? Cellular respiration, exactly. Then hemoglobin will dissociate or desaturate or unload, right? So low PO2 causes unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin for use in cellular respiration. So that's pretty damn logical, isn't it? Okay, so more oxygen you load, less oxygen you unload. Okay, this one's not quite as logical, so you have to think about it for just a second. pH. Do you have any prediction in your head as to which capillary bed would be lower in pH? Systemic. I agree with you. Can anybody explain why? More what? More carbon dioxide, more hydrogen ions, right? Because this damn equation they've been trying to shove down your face hole all semester long, ear holes primarily. I'm not really shoving it down your face holes, ear holes. So all semester long, this little bastard, which is going to be easy today because you've seen it so many times, which is why I always teach it early because this is the last day of class and you're like, don't make me learn hard things. So in low pH situations, and can we agree that typically speaking, a metabolically active systemic tissue would probably have more carbon dioxide than, for instance, the lungs. Yes? Okay. Then high pH will cause loading, comparatively higher pH. I'm not saying it has to be 8. I'm saying higher than the other capillary beds, just comparatively higher. Comparatively higher pH will cause loading. Comparatively lower pH will cause unloading. Right? Does that make sense? And that is because of this reaction right here. And so all you really need to do is think, again, start at the forest, what should be true at pulmonary capillary beds, what should be true at systemic capillary beds. Systemic capillary, everything that goes on there should favor what? Loading or unloading? Unloading. Yes? And so what should the pH be there? It should be lower because more carbon dioxide. That means lower pH favors unloading. Does that make sense? So again, think about the thing that you are confident in first. Yes? And then memorize the things that go with it, right? So you are confident, are you not, that what should happen at systemic capillary beds is you should unload oxygen. Yes? And what should happen at pulmonary capillary beds is that you should load oxygen. Good? Okay. And then figure out what's true at those two capillary beds and correlate that with unloading or loading. Good? Okay. All right. So PCO2 shouldn't be hard for you. What do you think is going to be true about PCO2? Which capillary bed is going to have a higher PCO2? Systemic. And so what do you predict that a higher PCO2 will do to loading or unloading of oxygen? Unloading. So you got it now, right? So increase in PCO2 causes hemoglobin to let go of oxygen, like in systemic capillaries. So high PCO2 causes unloading of oxygen from hemoglobin. Low PCO2 would cause the opposite. Good? Not too bad? Okay, temperature. Which capillary beds do you think is generally, not always, but generally warmer, especially when it's metabolically active? Systemic capillary beds tend to be warmer. And warm tends to cause loading or unloading? Unloading. So you got the prediction true now. So an increase in temperature causes more unloadings of oxygen from hemoglobin. And this occurs in any tissue that's really active. As it gets hotter, more active, skeletal muscle, liver after you had 5 cocktails, whatever, right? It's going to cause unloading of oxygen, which makes sense, right? Okay, all right. So, and then this one probably won't make a whole lot of sense until I explain it. Okay, so there's this chemical called 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate or 2,3-diphosphoglycerate. You can call it BPG or DPG. Nobody is very consistent about which one they use. BPG or DPG. So here's the deal. Red blood cells. Red blood cells have metabolism, but they only do glycolysis. They don't do cellular respiration because they don't have any mitochondria, or they don't do oxidative phosphorylation, I should say, because they don't have any mitochondria. Everybody with me? Okay, but when red blood cells sense that their metabolism is very high, as indicated by the byproduct that they produce from glycolysis called DPG, you with me? Okay. Then they say, hey, I'm really busy. Maybe you should go to work, oxygen. And they knock it off. So as DPG increases as an indication that the red blood cell metabolism is higher, it pushes oxygen out. Good? Okay, so in more metabolically active tissues, as the red blood cells are going through metabolically active tissues, and they are also metabolically active, right, makes DPG as a byproduct, and DPG goes, I'm at work, you go to work, oxygen, and kicks it out. Does that make sense? It's not because a red blood cell is doing a damn thing with oxygen. It doesn't use it, right? It just carries it around, right? It's just an oxygen bus. But it says, we're all working really hard, get off your tuchus and go to work, oxygen. So it kicks the oxygen out. So in metabolically active tissues, you tend to produce more BPG, DPG, and it unloads. So what do you guys think? Typically speaking, are the lungs or other tissues usually going to be more metabolically active? Other tissues, because the lungs are primarily doing passive gas exchange. Not exclusively, but primarily doing passive gas exchange. So as BPG increases or DPG increases, does it cause loading or unloading? Unloading, yes. Okay, so DPG tends to be higher at systemic capillaries than it is at pulmonary capillaries and favors unloading. All right, here's the summary. You ready? It's not that bad. Swear, it's not. In systemic capillaries, what tends to be true will all favor what? Systemic capillaries. Unloading. So let's look at what tends to be true in systemic capillaries. Low PO2 comparatively, yes. Low pH comparatively, yes. High PCO2, high temperature, high BPG. All of those favor one more time? Unloading. See? It's not that bad, right? Just go from what you know to the unfamiliar things. However, in pulmonary capillary beds, everything that is happening there should favor what? Loading, exactly. Pulmonary capillary beds, what tends to be true, higher PO2, higher pH, yes? Lower PCO2, lower temperature, lower BPG. All of those favor one more time? Loading. Got it? Okay, all of that. Good? Okay, let's talk about carbon monoxide for a second. Carbon monoxide is both pertinent and also really, really interesting. Carbon monoxide is that boy whose mama did not raise him right. Because here's what carbon monoxide does. When you breathe in carbon monoxide, what it does is it takes up the seats for the oxygen and it won't let them go. It has a greater affinity for the heme group of hemoglobin than does oxygen, and it's hard to knock it off. So when you breathe in carbon monoxide, it takes up the spaces for oxygen, okay? And then if you breathe it in again, so it's not going to kill you if you breathe it in for 10 seconds, right? But as you breathe it in repetitively, what happens is it pushes oxygen out of the seat, it takes the seat, and then it won't make eye contact as it's texting on its damn phone, right? And it's probably doing this too, isn't it? On public transportation, you know it is, right? It's probably doing that, right? Because his mama didn't raise it right. So it's going to sit there, and then what's going to happen as you breathe in more and more carbon dioxide is it's going to take up more and more of the seats for oxygen until you're carrying hardly any oxygen to speak of. And then you are going to get flu-like symptoms, really exhausted, sometimes fall asleep, not wake up. This is important for us all to know because in Utah, most homes are heated by natural gas. You're heated by fossil fuels. So what happens is carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless byproduct of burning fossil fuels, okay? If your home is improperly vented, then what happens is that colorless, odorless gas goes into the air and you just start inhaling it and you have no idea. Unless, of course, you have a carbon monoxide monitor, which you should in this state even if you PO. Because I know I've been really PO and you need a carbon monoxide detector because if you're poor, you probably have not had your system checked as regularly as someone who is really, really wealthy. And so you're more likely to have leaks. So you need to spend $50 on a carbon monoxide detector because the people who are most likely to die of carbon monoxide detector are little kids. And every damn year people die of carbon monoxide poisoning, especially when I lived in Texas. So I don't know. We can make fun of Utah people all we want. And now that I've been here long enough, I feel like I can. But let's be serious. Texas has lots to make fun of, okay? Just damn near the whole state. It's a big old armed joke. So every single winter, it takes people by surprise that it gets cold there. And it gets bitter cold in Texas. And no fluffy snow. It's just like sleet going laterally at your eye holes. It's horrible. So it's really, really cold and really, really hot. And really, really cold and really, really hot. But nobody's ever prepared for the cold, no matter how many times it comes. And they haven't checked their heating. They turn on the heating and it doesn't work. And most of our heating is electric there. So they take in the thing that they know always lights because we're in Texas and that's their barbecue grill. They take it into their damn house. They light up the damn barbecue grill. And then they end up in the hospital because of carbon monoxide poisoning. I shit you not. Every single year when I was teaching there for 5 years, one person in the class said, my cousin, Cletus, brought in his barbecue grill, and then everybody almost died. They didn't usually die because we were used to it by then. So you know, they knew. They're like, oh, Cletus, let's go. What?
No, nothing.
But, you know, there's rednecks in Utah, too. Don't think I haven't been to the south of the state. I don't know how you people got southern accents. How did that happen? Southern Utah? They all sound like a bunch of hicks. And we are supposed to be the hicks. You know that. So Texas is supposed to be the hicks. So carbon monoxide poisoning. So this is reason number 275 that we probably need to come up with a really, really useful alternative to burning fossil fuels all the damn time. Another one we will see in just a second. Okay, so carbon dioxide. How about transporting carbon dioxide? It's actually transported in a different mechanism than seems logical until you figure out what it's trying to accomplish. It's actually pretty damn cool. So carbon dioxide transport. If we talk about carbon dioxide transport, first off, we need to carry boatloads of carbon dioxide, even more when we're metabolically active, but we need to have really minor changes on blood pH. Because remember, blood gets pissed off if it's not 7.35 to 7.45, right? So how do you carry massive quantities of carbon dioxide with minor changes in pH? Well, you manipulate how it's actually carried. So let's show what's going to go on there. So of the carbon dioxide that's created by cellular respiration, 7% is just traveling in the blood plasma as CO2. And that directly adds to the PCO2. But we don't carry most of it as CO2. We actually carry more of it actually inside the red blood cell and stuck to not the old lady seats, but a different seat on the same bus. So it's not out competing oxygen. So it goes inside the red blood cell and rides on the globin portion, not the heme portion of hemoglobin. And it's called carbaminohemoglobin, and it doesn't change the color of the blood because it's not bound to oxygen. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah? So it's a different seat. And you can actually carry both of them at the same time, right? You can actually carry oxygen on the heme and carbon dioxide on the globin, and they don't outcompete one another. So it's a different seat. Okay, so that's 23%. But then 70% of it is going to use this equation that you love so much
No.
2 more times before the damn semester's over, right? Okay, so here we go. Ready? This looks horrible. It's not that bad. So stick with me for a second. Okay, carbon dioxide, which is made by cellular respiration. I know you hate me. It's fine. As long as you're smart, you can hate me. Carbon dioxide, made by cellular respiration, is going to, of course, diffuse out of the cells, ultimately into the blood plasma. 7% of it just rides as carbon dioxide in the blood plasma. What about the rest? The rest, 23%, stick with me, goes and attaches to the heme portion of hemoglobin, right? Doesn't take up a seat or anything. But then we still have 70% of the carbon dioxide. What? Oh, sorry. I was testing you. You did great. Everybody else failed. So the globin portion of hemoglobin. So, and it doesn't outcompete oxygen. So globin portion of hemoglobin. So that, and that's just like held on to by the globin portion of hemoglobin. But then the rest of it, what you are going to do is you are going to force this reaction this way, and then you're going to pick what you do with these two, which will allow you to carry boatloads of carbon dioxide with minor changes in pH. So here's what you're going to do. You ready? Okay. I'm going to take the rest of the carbon dioxide, 70% of it, and I'm going to do the equation that you've learned 3,000 times. CO2 plus H2O via carbonic anhydrase will form carbonic acid, right? Carbonic acid will dissociate to bicarbonate ion plus H+. But how about if I don't let go of the H+? If I don't put it into solution, it doesn't impact pH. What if I just take it and stick it to a negative amino acid of a hemoglobin? Just hold on to it temporarily, right? Because it's a positive ion. Just slap it onto a negative amino acid. Then I can carry lots of it with almost no impact on pH whatsoever. And then, just in case the pH has changed a little bit, why don't I take that bicarbonate ion and shove it back into the blood plasma? But yes, to buffer the carbon dioxide that's in there, or buffer the H+ that's in there. But I want to maintain my electrochemical gradient in the red blood cell. So when I push all those negatives out, I bring a negative back in. This is called the chloride shift. So what I temporarily do is I push the bicarbonate out, I bring a negative chloride in, I hold on to it, right? Okay. And now I can carry tons of carbon dioxide with really minor impacts on pH, because I do this in every damn red blood cell. And this occurs in the systemic capillaries. Does that make sense to you guys? Go ahead.
Okay, so you're tacking the lone hydrogen ion onto the hemoglobin.
Onto the hemoglobin.
It's taking a ride.
Yep.
That's not affecting
Nope.
pH.
Nope.
Okay, and then the HCO3 pops into the plasma.
To buffer.
To buffer, and then to balance that out, the chloride
Chloride.
goes into the red blood cell.
Yes.
Or whatever.
It is red blood cell. It's always red blood cell. That's what it's doing. Into the red blood cell to help balance out the pH. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is what happens in the systemic capillaries. I'll bet you are brilliant and can figure out what happens in pulmonary capillaries. Because can you breathe out bicarbonate ion? Because it's mostly bicarbonate ion that you're carrying. 70% of it is carried up by a carbonate ion. But it's not gas. So you can't breathe it out. So what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to reverse the whole damn thing, right? So when we get to the pulmonary capillary beds, we're going to do this equation. Ready? Okay. So it's not as bad as it looks, I promise. So what's the easiest thing to get rid of? Well, the carbon dioxide that was 7% in the blood plasma, just get rid of that first, right? What's the next easiest thing to get rid of? Well, the carbon dioxide that was bound as carbon dioxide to the globin portion of hemoglobin, that's 27%, or 23%. Yeah? So get rid of that. Good? And then what do I do to get the other portion back into carbon dioxide? Reverse the whole damn thing. So here we go. Okay? I'm going to let go of the H plus that I was holding on to temporarily. Good. I'm going to reverse the chloride shift, bring in that bicarbonate ion, and then I'm going to reverse this equation. H plus HCO3 minus makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, via the same enzyme, dissociates to water that nobody gives a crap about, and carbon dioxide, which is now a gas, and you can breathe it out. Good? Okay. Are you glad that this is not the first time you've seen this equation? Yes. Good job, Melanie.
Fluoride part one more time. Sorry.
How about I just say the whole damn thing again? Because I don't know what I said.
Beginning, go for it.
I have no idea what I said. Okay, so at the pulmonary capillaries, let's get rid of all the carbon dioxide. Easiest to get rid of, 7% that was already in the blood plasma. Breathe that out. Whoops. Next easiest to get rid of, bound as carbon dioxide to the globin portion, 23%. Get rid of that. Okay. Now I've got 70% I still have to get rid of, but it's not in breathable form. So let's put it back in breathable form. Let's reverse the chloride shift to bring in the bicarbonate ion and put the chloride back out. Good. Let's dissociate that H plus from where it was temporarily held on that negative amino acid, right? Let's take those two, make them into carbonic acid, use the same enzyme, which is carbonic anhydrase, and actually dissociate that to water and carbon dioxide and breathe it out. Good? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was doing that.
Oh, okay, you were thinking about it, okay.
So is it moving out because of the partial pressure?
Yes, because of the partial pressure. Once you get to the pulmonary capillaries, the partial pressure in the atmosphere that we are breathing of carbon dioxide, as long as you make it into a gas, then the air that we breathe in was really low, PCO2, right? And the blood that's coming back to the lungs is relatively higher PCO2. Remember, the air that we breathe in is about 0.3 millimeters of mercury, PCO2, really low, right? There's not that much carbon dioxide in the air. Now, related to his question, do you think there's any potential impact on physiology if we continue to increase the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere as we are doing? Yeah, so if we, for instance, continue to change the gradient of the carbon dioxide, so we're not going to stop generating carbon dioxide because we can't be satisfied because we're a living organism. What we are doing, and we are doing it relatively quickly, I realize that in this state we try to pretend that science doesn't actually matter, but I'm not going to. What we are doing is we are increasing carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And what we're doing is we're jacking up the gradient. And at this point, it's not causing any problem with the natural gradient of PCO2, but at some point in the future, that is one of the many, many physiological changes that we may have to deal with. And I don't know how we would manipulate that, right? How would we manipulate that so that there was not a concentration to deal with? Does that make sense? Okay. You guys are getting wiggly. Class isn't over, is it? Okay, all right. I was like, what the hell's going on? Because there's this wiggle thing that happens right at the end of class that always lets me know that I'm talking too long. But that was not it. Because sometimes I just forget, and sometimes I get excited. I'm talking about climate change. Oh my gosh, I don't usually get to talk about that. Okay, all right. So chloride shift. So now here's the question: what drives it that way versus what drives it that way? It's simply the concentration. It's the PCO2. So when PCO2 is high, it drives the equation this way. And that happens in which capillary bed? Pulmonary or systemic? Systemic, yeah. And when PCO2 is low, it drives the equation this way. And that happens in pulmonary capillary beds, right? So that's the driving force with that same equation being driven two different ways. Is that okay? Okay, so let's talk about how to alter PCO2, right? So you could alter PCO2 by stopping cellular respiration, but that would be shooting your damn foot off, right? Okay. So how do you alter PCO2? Well, you have to alter it by ventilation, right? So the primary way that you alter PCO2 is by changing your breathing rate, right? So by altering your rate of ventilation, if you increase ventilation, if you hyperventilate, not necessarily meaning you're making yourself pass out, but just faster than normal level, if you hyperventilate, you blow off carbon dioxide. You can hyperventilate to the point that you blow off too much carbon dioxide. Does that make sense? And that will alter your H plus concentration. And you will do what? Make yourself more acidic or more basic if you blow off. Yeah, blow off. So you will get what's called respiratory alkalosis in that situation when you hyperventilate. So what does your mama tell you to do when you're snot crying and hyperventilating? You've been there before. Don't tell me you haven't, right? Breathe into a paper bag. Not plastic, because she does not want you to die, but paper, right? And what's the deal with breathing into the paper? Let's put the fizz together. What's the deal? You're breathing in more carbon dioxide than atmospheric carbon dioxide, right? Because you just breathed it out and you're breathing it back in, and it can help reset your pH, right? Does that make sense? So again, mom is usually partially right? Usually partially right. Go ahead.
Okay, so question. So when we like sedate kids and they're like freaking out before, they always say that they're gonna go apneic, right? And they usually do. Is that to like conserve the CO2 as well? Is that doing the same thing? Because they stop breathing.
When they stop breathing.
Yeah.
A lot of times it will result in you stopping the hyperventilation. They'll usually start breathing again without intervention, though, don't they?
Yeah, but it's like when they first get sedated, then they just like they'll stop breathing.
And do you just wait for them to start again, or do you actually?
Or I'll just bag them.
Oh, okay.
Give them air.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of times that's a really your brain's rescue mechanism to say you're jacking up the pH entirely too much. You've got to stop. And usually, if they're otherwise healthy, they'll start breathing again really quickly. It'll like interrupt the process. So that's an interesting application that I hadn't thought of before. Okay, what if you stop breathing out, right? So decreased ventilation or problems with ventilation like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, in which you can't get air in and out effectively because, I don't know, any number of things. Emphysema, chronic bronchitis, smoking, any number of things. So what happens in that one is that you're generating carbon dioxide and you can't stop because you're alive, right? But you can't get rid of it. And so what happens in that situation is you end up increasing H plus and not going into respiratory alkalosis, but respiratory acidosis, which is way the heck harder to treat. Can't just breathe into a damn paper bag. You've got to figure out some way to reset your pH and your carbon dioxide concentration. Usually medical intervention is needed in that situation. So that's respiratory acidosis. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And then the last thing before we do the clinical applications is just control of ventilation. Control of ventilation is actually pretty damn easy to understand. So all I'm saying here is what is it about your sensory motor response that changes your rates of ventilation? So what can you do? Well, there's some voluntary stuff you can do because, of course, you got skeletal muscle involved, and you can, to a certain degree, control your breathing rate until you piss off your brain. And then your brain will say, give me the car keys back, you can't be trusted. Generally speaking, this is neural control, and we'll talk about the sensory input in just a second. Here's what's going on. The action potentials that control your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles originate ultimately, I mean, they're not directly attached, but they ultimately are controlled by the pons and the medulla oblongata, right? Pons and medulla oblongata both have respiratory centers, and they work together. They don't do exactly the same thing. And here's what happens. Ever since you came out of the womb and started breathing, right, what happens is the inspiratory neurons that are controlled by the pons and the medulla oblongata, they're inherently excitable and rhythmic. It's not like a pacemaker potential, but it's a rhythmicity that started in the nervous system. And what it does is the somatic nervous system sends out through the phrenic nerves and the intercostal nerves a stimulus rhythmically to cause contraction. And it's actually a relatively consistent signal for about 2 seconds during normal tidal breathing, saying contract, 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 right? And then it shuts off, and then you get passive exhalation. And then it starts again, right? And that's really good that your pons and your medulla oblongata are taking care of it because your cerebral cortex has enough to do. Can you imagine what you would not get accomplished during the day if you had to remind yourself to breathe? Like, we would all be dead. right? I'd be like, oh my God, I was playing freaking Fortnite if you're my 13-year-old and he didn't breathe for like 72 hours straight. So the stimulus, Fortnite makes children into buttheads. I would just like to tell you that. Stimulus stops after about 2 seconds and then the muscles relax and the passive recoil of the lungs is what causes passive exhalation. What about your expiratory neurons? Those don't fire all the time. They're not rhythmic. They're when needed, right? So when my expiratory neurons fire is like now when I'm talking because I'm making them, right? Or during exercise. So they're basically firing as needed. So this is primarily sending impulse to the intercostal nerves, to the internal intercostal muscles. Forced expiration, shut off, inspiration begins again, right? So this is normally how breathing is actually going just rhythmically. But what kinds of things can alter your respiration rate? So this is motor output. Now I want to talk about sensory input. What kind of sensory input or what kind of control can alter your respiration rates? Well, your cerebral cortex can to a degree. So if I hold my breath, I can do that until I piss off my brain. My brain gets pissed off really, really easily with carbon dioxide concentrations, right? So it will make you breathe. So all of you who are parents or who have been parents, who have teeny tiny little people who haven't pissed you off yet, at one point somebody's going to try to hold their breath to death to get something. Let them. Then teach them the fizz. Right? Let them do it, teach them the fizz, and then give them a quiz. That'll teach them. So,
That's not hate me if I do that one.
huh? That's fine. That's that, like he was being a little jackass. He should hate you. So you can also voluntarily hyperventilate until you piss your brain off, and then it'll make you stop in that situation, even if it wasn't particularly voluntary, right? The higher brain centers are also connected to the respiratory center and the medulla, and then your limbic system, hypothalamus, emotional alligator brain is also able to control breathing to a certain degree, right? Which is why when you're super duper freaked out, you can start hyperventilating, right? That emotional center. But all of that will not win against these things. So the primary things that you are doing is monitoring what's going on in the bloodstream. You're monitoring carbon dioxide, pH, and oxygen. And those are going to really, over the course of a day, determine when your ventilation rate increases or decreases. Now, counterintuitively, the thing that is the most powerful respiratory stimulant at rest is not oxygen. So I don't breathe because of lack of oxygen as much as I breathe because of too much carbon dioxide. So let's look at what actually happens there. So these are called the central chemoreceptors because they're part of the central nervous system. And here's what happens. As carbon dioxide starts to increase in the bloodstream, there's nothing you can do to keep it from diffusing into the cerebrospinal fluid because it's easily diffusible into the cerebrospinal fluid. So it diffuses into the cerebrospinal fluid and it does this damn equation again, right? Yeah? And then this equation occurs, but here's the deal. The cerebrospinal fluid has damn near no buffering system at all. And so as soon as this occurs, the cerebrospinal fluid and the medulla tells the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata says, oh, hell no, right? No, we are not allowing this level of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. And so even with minor changes in PCO2, that will cause respiration increases. So it's really, really sensitive because there's nothing to stop this diffusion and there's nothing to buffer it once it gets in there. So notice if it was actual pH of the blood and not PCO2 of the blood, that can't get in. Do you see that? The H plus has no diffusion mechanism into the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's actually really, really sensitive to PCO2. So this is called central chemoreceptors because they're in the central nervous system, right? This is the most sensitive thing. And then the other one is the pH of the blood. You are less sensitive to the pH of the blood because it doesn't diffuse into your cerebrospinal fluid, but you are monitoring it, and you're monitoring it at the same places that you monitor the chemical content of the blood for the cardiovascular system. So remember, you monitored it in the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, okay? We are going to monitor the same thing, so same sensory input, right, that says low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, or low pH. We're going to send it to the same places, right? We're going to send it to the medulla oblongata, also the pons. We're going to have a different motor output. With the cardiovascular system, if I detected, for instance, low pH, right, I would activate the sympathetic nervous system and increase heart rate and all that business, right? Here, I'm not talking about sympathetic because this is controlled by somatic. But what I'm going to do is if I detect low pH here, I'm going to tell on it. I'm going to say, hey, medulla oblongata and pons, we got an issue here. Then the medulla oblongata and pons is going to say, oh, okay, I'm going to send out more inspiratory neurons to increase respiration, right? So same sensory input, different motor output, probably occurring at the same time a lot of times, right? Increase heart rate and increase respiration if you got a pH issue. Make sense? Okay, so the increase of H plus in the blood affects what we call the peripheral chemoreceptors because they're out here in the periphery, right? Low blood pH doesn't always have to be due to carbon dioxide, but this is always what I help with it. I will always increase respiration to help take care of pH. And then the counterintuitively, the thing that actually has the least power in increasing respiration is the PO2 of the blood. So the PO2 is actually detected here and here as well, but it doesn't really respond, it doesn't really cause a ventilation rate response until it gets below about 60 millimeters of mercury. Then it will stimulate peripheral chemoreceptors and cause an increase in breathing. But really low oxygen is not correlated to an increase in respiration as quickly as high carbon dioxide or low pH. So it's actually less powerful than you imagine, but it can increase the ventilation rate. Does that make sense? So one of the things that students get confused about, I don't know if I mentioned this to you guys real quick. One of the students get confused about is that, so if you breathe out more, if you increase your ventilation rate, we can all agree that you're putting more carbon dioxide out, and you're potentially bringing more oxygen in, yes? But does more oxygen in mean directly that you're going to make more carbon dioxide via cellular respiration? No, right? Because cellular respiration doesn't just occur because you have oxygen. It occurs because you need oxygen for metabolism, right? So you can blow off carbon dioxide and you can bring in oxygen. It'll still only move down its concentration gradient if you already had enough of it, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you are also going to make more carbon dioxide because there's like 40 freaking chemical equations there that you're not going to do unless you need them, right? Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. And then the last little tidbit is just to cover these. Where the hell did they go? There we are. The last, the clinical applications, clinical connections. So let's talk about what these are. And these are mostly related to breathing, not gas exchange. Okay. So these are ventilation or resistance problems, okay? So COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is a really broad general term. It simply means that something is obstructing air from getting in and out adequately, and it's a breathing problem. And it increases resistance, generally speaking. What are some things that lead to COPD? Chronic bronchitis, which causes mucus, inflammation, and scarring of the tubes will increase resistance and therefore decrease flow. And then long-term irritation. So if you have long-term irritation, like with smoking, you can cause COPD with that. Air pollution can cause it. If you were in Utah and you're a smoker, you got a death wish. All those people vaping, I'm like, you're practically vaping just walking around here in the winter, right? You don't need to like add to it. In addition, you look like a moron, let's be honest. Okay, and then emphysema. Emphysema is really interesting. So with emphysema, what should be true about your little alveolar bundles is that they should be really, really a whole bunch of alveoli. But with emphysema over time, not initially, what happens is you break down the walls so that you lose surface area for gas exchange. So with emphysema, first thing is the alveolar walls start to lose their elasticity. And so instead of the snapback that helps with expiration, they stop having that. And then later on, you break down the walls and lose surface area. And so here's a healthy lung. Look at how incredibly dense it is. It looks like really solid tissue. Here's a lung with emphysema. See how much surface area you've lost for gas exchange? And that surface area ends up causing tremendous problems with not ventilation, but respiration, right? And by the time it gets to this point, it's irreversible. Emphysema is primarily associated with long-term exposure to respiratory irritants and with smoking. best way to get yourself some emphysema is to smoke. And you've seen people, of course, in their elderly years pulling along oxygen tanks. So if you have really, really bad gas exchange, you need a really, really high concentration of oxygen to get it actually to move in. Does that make sense? You still can have problems with carbon dioxide, though. And then last two are asthma. Asthma is simply when you get smooth muscle bronchial constriction, usually because of either allergy or sometimes it can even be emotional, and causes wheezing and gasping for air because the resistance went up so much, right? It's often accompanied also by chronic inflammation and mucus accumulation, and it can lead to COPD if it's not treated really aggressively, and sometimes even if it is. So what do you use for the treatment for asthma? Anti-inflammatories, right? But also bronchodilators. It will actually allow for your bronchioles to dilate. That makes sense? And then if it's really, really, really serious, you would use steroid anti-inflammatories. Okay, and then last one, pneumonia is an inflammatory condition that results with fluid all the way through the airways. So you get fluid all the way down. You can even get fluid in your alveoli. When you have excess fluid in your alveoli, it provides an extra impediment for gas exchange, for the oxygen and carbon dioxide to transport across. And it can kill you. It's usually a secondary complication of some other kind of issue. Usually some kind of respiratory infection that has pneumonia as a secondary complication. Has anybody in here ever had pneumonia? It feels like you're drowning, doesn't it? It's like crazy and scary at the same time. Like you feel like you're underwater. It's really, really scary. And you can't get any air actually in and out. So that's what pneumonia has to do with. And we are done. Go ahead.
Does it also inhibit surfactant?
It will inhibit surfactant as those cells are kind of drowned, but they usually don't even get stretched enough that you would release surfactant because you have trouble with actually the stretching before that.